It's my pleasure to introduce Reverend James T. Bretzke. Father Bretzke is a Jesuit priest and a professor of moral theology on the ecclesiastical faculty of Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. He's an accomplished veteran in reading the Roman tea leaves found in both church documents and gatherings, such as the recently concluded Synod on the Family. Some of you may already be aware of Father Bretzke's insights on synodal proceedings and documents. You may have been here last year when he gave his analysis on the Extraordinary Synod, what I think of as part one of the bishops discussing families. If you weren't here, you may have watched it online. It's a very popular video on the Encore page that Melinda just spoke about. And so you could actually watch back to back last year's presentation and this year's in about a month. Father Bretzke did both his doctorate in moral theology and taught at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, and has also taught in Jesuit institutions in Seoul, Korea, Manila, Philippines, as well as Berkeley, San Francisco, and his native Milwaukee. I should mention now that he also speaks 6 languages. He has authored over 90 scholarly articles and reviews, and 7 books, including the Handbook of Roman Catholic Moral Terms and Consecrated Phrases, a Latin theological dictionary, both of which garnered awards from the Catholic Press Association in the reference book category. They are valuable resources for anyone's library. For example, when I feel my Latin's a little rusty, I always double check myself by consulting consecrated phrases. His book, which is up there on the screen, A Morally Complex World, Engaging Contemporary Moral Theology, is widely used around the world and is soon to be released as an ebook, an upcoming addition to my Kindle, I'm sure. Father Bretzke helps out at St. Michael's Catholic Parish in Bedford. Now, Melinda Donovan, who just started us off, listed this fact on a sheet of paper when she was helping me prepare the introduction, but I'd like to tell you how I knew that already. Several years ago, I was attending a Christmas party of a local company at a local restaurant, and we were given nameplates of where to sit. And my husband and I shared polite conversation with the couple across the table from us until they became very animated in talking about the homilies by one of the priests who came to their parish every week. It turned out they were St. Michael's parishioners, and the homilies they admired were Father Bretzke's. If Father Bretzke seems like a familiar face or voice, you may have heard him on the radio, seen him on TV, or read his quotes in the paper, because he's the frequently go-to guy on church matters for local, international, and national media outlets. I heard him within the last few days on NPR, for example. Jim can give more content in one soundbite than many give in a paragraph. So I'm going to stop speaking paragraphs and turn this over to Father Bretzke.
Thank you, Barbara. That was very, very kind. So we have a lot of ground to cover, so let us get right to it. And I want to start with sort of a disclaimer. There are many and diverse ways of looking at the Synod: theological, political, geographical, historical, to name but just a few. I would propose as sort of an umbrella lens the concept of culture. Culture is one of our basic ways of being human, both individually and socially. And my operative thesis is that many of the debates, the divisions, the tensions, as well as the emerging consensus, positive alliances, and so on, can be interpreted helpfully as cultural encounters and expressions. 2 core concepts from cultural anthropology will be of particular assistance here. One is the notion of what in cultural anthropology are called fundamental values, and the second is the construction of root paradigms. I've written extensively in this area, but would like to offer just a quick thumbnail stipulative definition. Aligning myself with he who must always be named, namely Karl Rahner, I would define fundamental values as what Rahner terms global pre-scientific convictions. These are so core to our view of the world that these values often frame the arguments in ways we often are only dimly aware of. Rahner says these are frequently hineingeschmuggelt, literally smuggled into our evaluative discourse. One American example of a fundamental value is egalitarianism, the one person, one vote principle. Thus, any identified non-represented or underrepresented constituency would call into question the moral legitimacy of the whole enterprise. How these fundamental values take shape in culture is often through root paradigms. These are the basic structures or complexes of values that once again express the way things are, or at least the way things ought to be. I would observe that in this synod we see a number of fundamental values and root paradigms clashing with one another. So stay tuned for some examples. If we accept my cultural paradigm as a way of guiding our analysis and evaluation, then there are certain do's and don'ts this will entail. One of the don'ts is to not use culture in a reductionistic or overly simplistic way, as I think we see being done here. There is no culture of death, or life, or encounter that exists somehow independently of human beings. And the danger is to fall into the temptation to consider ourselves delegated to separate the sheep from the goats, keeping ourselves with the former, and our opponents being cast out with the latter. On the other hand, these expressions can be helpful in focusing on cultural values, practices, attitudes, institutions, which in turn may be more or less promotive of core values, such as respect, life, common good, and so on. Paradigms are highly successful models that work well for long periods of time, such as the view that the geocentric paradigm that held everything in the heavens revolved around the earth. However, even good paradigms are necessarily open to change or revision, and sometimes revolution, when new information, new forces, new challenges, etc., enter upon the scene. I think if we were to look back at the last three pontificates, we might be able to discern slightly different operative paradigms vis-a-vis the church, its mission, and its relation to the gospel, as I've outlined here in this slide. Paradigms almost never shift easily or peacefully, and I believe that a good deal of both the headline-grabbing events connected with the synod, as well as a good deal of the backstory, can be decoded at least partially in terms of paradigm change dynamics. Now this is from the one picture is worth 1,000 word division, and I think this is a good example of the paradigm shift I'm trying to talk about. I think that this picture would have been literally unimaginable in any previous pontificate. I mean, I don't think even Pope John the 23rd would have been comfortable being caught on camera in this way. But clearly we have a different paradigm operative here. Looking back to the last synod that Barbara talked about in her introduction, the Extraordinary Synod that concluded a year ago, here was the Pope's opening address for that synod. And we see here his accent on the desire for openness or parousia. Parousia is a Greek word that means to speak candidly or without fear. What in Italian might be called a confronto americano. I probably don't have to translate that for too many of you, except to say that in Italian, a confronto americano is always negative. It is never positive. Whereas in the United States, we might translate it as a frank discussion, and it might be tension-filled, but we would see it as an important positive development. Whereas in Italy, it would be seen as a kind of brutta figura, an ugly figure. And to have this kind of a discussion in the Synod aula certainly is a paradigm shift. Mercy versus truth. Here we see two contenders from last year's Battle of the Books that are both still on the theological bestseller list. Cardinal Walter Casper's Mercy was endorsed by Pope Francis himself, while Remaining in the Truth of Christ is a collection of 9 essays allied with Cardinals Raymond Burke and Gerhard Müller and others, including Cardinal Carlo Caffarra, who was one of the signatories of a protest letter delivered to the Pope at the beginning of this year's Synod, and I'll talk more about that in just a bit. Mercy has probably become the code word for pastoral accommodation, allowing the divorced and remarried to return to the sacraments, whereas truth is oft used as a battle cry of those seeking to hold the line on this and many related issues, including greater tolerance of gays and lesbians. Discipline versus doctrine is another cultural divide related to mercy and truth. How one views contemplated change in pastoral practice, such as allowing the divorced and the remarried to return to the sacraments without an annulment. If really it is just a change in church discipline, even if it is large, then it is certainly possible. On the other hand, if the discipline is a Siamese twin of the accompanying doctrine, then to separate one from the other may mean sacrificing the doctrine. Now, in the interim between last October and this October, there is a good deal of lead up to the synod that just concluded. And here we see just one example of how some commentators were casting the next synod. I would say that this sort of discourse makes the Republican presidential debates look like a love-in by comparison. Theologically, I would like to recall for us all the promise that Jesus made as his own valedictory address, that he would be with us to the end of the ages. And in John's Gospel, he promised to send with us the Spirit that would continue to teach and remind and support us. And I think that these promises are still in play. Moving ahead to one of the core debates is this notion of living in sin. It was a theological shibboleth that marked out both sides of the controversy. Traditionally, the term had been used to describe anyone living in what the church called an irregular union, whether it be an unmarried couple, those in a second marriage, anyone and everyone in any kind of same-sex relationship at all. The presumption was that these individuals were most likely in an objective state of mortal sin, and thus if they were to die unrepentant, they would be cast into hell. Here we see Cardinal Marx, one of the key German cardinals, going on record challenging this traditional theological label. On the other hand, Cardinal Raymond Burke is one of the most forthright and frequent spokespersons for retaining the traditional theological category. In this view, the divorced and remarried would be committing a mortal sin each and every time they would have conjugal relations, and thus they should continue to be barred from the sacraments, since they would be, in this view, manifestly unworthy and would be committing sacrilege to boot. Many of the more right-wing commentators in the run-up to the Synod were predicting that the Pope would rig it from the start, along with his heretical henchmen, but actually at the beginning, the opening of the Synod on October 4th, most of those fears have been laid to rest, even if not had completely subsided, because the Pope named people from across the theological spectrum and geographical spectrum too. We have to also keep in mind that this is a synod of bishops. It is not an ecumenical council or any other more broadly based gathering. There's nothing like a little palace intrigue in the opening scene to keep our attention fixed on the unfolding play. So at the end of the Extraordinary Synod in 2014, quite credible reports circulated that Cardinal Raymond Burke, accompanied by several other hierarchs, including New York's Cardinal Dolan, paid a visit to the Emeritus Bishop of Rome in his apartments in the Vatican Gardens. Apparently, they were hoping to convince Benedict to agree to speak on the record in some form or another that could be used against the perceived danger of an overly liberal Pope Francis. Benedict replied, it is said, that Francis is the Pope, and that he, Benedict, would have nothing further to say on this matter, publicly or privately. Burke, of course, then was removed from his Vatican post shortly after the last synod, and so his torch seemed to have been taken up by another cardinal, this time the Australian George Pell, who before the synod opened circulated a letter among select cardinals that would register their serious concerns with the Pope. The exact list of signatories is still debated, but those who have either admitted outright, like Cardinal Dolan, that they signed the letter or failed to deny it would include others such as the Houston's Cardinal Archbishop DiNardo, Bologna's recently retired Cardinal Carlo Cafara, and 10 or so other red hats. Apparently you had to be a cardinal to be invited to join in this missive. The Pope, though, repudiated their charges in a special off-the-record appearance in the Synod aula the day after the letter arrived. And he then warned the Synod participants of a hermeneutics of conspiracy. Cardinal Wuerl from Washington, D.C. has also emerged as a key ally of the Pope, and his remarks here clearly put him at odds with some of his brother cardinals and bishops, a point not lost on the media. So now we're to the beginning of the actual synod. And the opening address was given by Cardinal Peter Erdo, who was what they called the relator of the synod. And his address was supposed to have outlined the main points for discussion in the coming 3 weeks, based on their preparatory, what they call lineamenta, and the working document, the Instrumentum Laboris. However, the Cardinal's resulting address was clearly envisioned to be a sort of preemptive first strike to settle the debates before they had a chance to come up in the Synod aula. Some Synod Fathers asked that the Cardinal's address be included in the official documents of the Synod, but Pope Francis declined this request, reminding the participants that the only official documents were and would remain the Instrumentum Laboris, the eventual final report, and the Pope's own discourses. The parousia continues. Not only is no compromise possible, neither is any comprehensive summary of the various synod interventions, as the participants' 3-minute talks were called. And also in the afternoon, they had these small group language discussion by languages, 13 of them, called cercoli minores, little circles. So all I can do here is lift up a couple of key addresses that would be further evidence of my culture clash paradigm shift thesis. One of the most strident voices belonged to the president of the Polish Bishops' Conference, who in this statement left rather little to nuance. Gender ideology seemed to have emerged as the proverbial third rail that electrified debates both inside and outside the Synod aula. I suppose we might posit that perhaps here the Archbishop is engaging a tad in rhetorical hyperbole, but honestly I'm not sure if he would grant me this interpretation. I suspect that for him and for many others, the very concept of gender that is not absolutely identified in a one-to-one correspondence with physical genitalia is incredibly threatening on many levels. And some of our students here can tell you more during the break. Archbishop Charles Chaput, OFM Capuchin, was one of the 4 elected U.S. delegates to the Synod. 4 others were appointed by the Pope, including Cardinals Dole and Wuerl, Archbishop Supich, and Bishop George Murray, S.J. Chaput is a novitiate class made of our own Cardinal Sean O'Malley, and on some issues they would definitely be on the same page, for example, abortion. But in terms of tone and approach, I think that Chaput and O'Malley are often quite different. Here in his own words, Chaput outlines the battleground and the pastoral priorities as he sees them. And I'd lift up for special attention here his reconsideration of Jesus' strategy on risking the 99 sheep in efforts to go after the single lost sheep. It doesn't seem to be good long-term business sense, and that may be part of his Grace's unease with this approach. Striking a similar note was Cardinal Dolan, who talked about inclusion and minority rights that I think we could also see as fundamental values in American culture. And he's recasting these to say, well, here are the new minority that feel excluded from the church, and we need to reach out to them. And I hope you all had a chance to read that. Cardinal Robert Serra from Guinea is a prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of, not for Doctrine of Faith, for Divine Worship. And one of the complaints raised by some at the Extraordinary Synod last year and in the intervening months was the supposed preoccupation with communion for the divorced and remarried and GLBT issues that were largely identified with the West, Europe and North America in particular. Voices from Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, and to a lesser extent Latin America have arisen in the meantime. These voices do not belong to the Mormon Tabernacle Choir in that they hardly ever sing together in unison, but as someone who has lived for more than a decade outside the U.S., including several years in East Asia, I do believe these sorts of voices are in fact underrepresented in the church. Listening to them can also be a helpful corrective to an impression that how we think, what we think are the key issues, etc., are not necessarily the same around the world. That having been said, I think genuine intercultural and cross-cultural communication has to deal forthrightly with these kinds of challenges that Cardinal Serra raises here. He is hardly the lone voice in representing these views, though I believe his assessment and vocabulary, such as demonic origin, should not be left unchallenged. Lobbying certainly occurred in every part of the gathering, but in terms of my culture clash paradigm shift thesis, the following movement from the extreme right wing is particularly illustrative of a pathological hysteria in the church. Canon 212 refers to the section of the code which says the following: that the faithful have the right, and even at times the duty, to manifest to the sacred pastors their opinion on matters which pertain to the good of the church, and to make their opinion known to the rest of the Christian faithful without prejudice to the integrity of faith and morals, with reverence toward their pastors, and attentive to common advantage and the dignity of persons, close quote. Now, clearly, in the view of this and similar movements, the Synod risks going so far off the rails that the most prudent response would be a wholesale walkout on the part of the faithful and Orthodox bishops. None, though, ultimately signed this particular petition, and Cardinal George Pell from Australia explicitly rejected the call. I am a Jesuit, and so I have to lift up my brother Jesuit here. We also have been Jesuits. I've been a Jesuit 1 year longer. I've known him since he was a lad. Bishop George Murray, Bishop of Youngstown, Ohio, was named by Pope Francis as a papal delegate to the Synod, and the Pope named 2. He named Archbishop Supich, who had been elected by the Catholic bishops as a substitute, but the Pope did not name the other substitute who was elected, who was Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone from San Francisco, who would be allied more with the culture warrior approach. In the pontificate of Pope John Paul II, Donald Wuerl was clearly seen as a rising star, and his own conservative credentials were judged secure. It does seem now that he has secured his current post as Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C., that more and more his pastoral instincts seem to be emerging into greater prominence. Or perhaps, as some cynics might suggest, he has his finger to the changing ecclesiastical winds. On the other hand, where are you going to go once you're a Cardinal Archbishop? There's only one place higher, and I don't think Americans are going to get there. I would like to think that he genuinely is convinced that Pope Francis's approach is most in tune with both the gospel and the needs of the current age. He definitely seems to be a hierarch who has both welcomed and embraced this pastoral paradigm shift. Probably the clearest so-called Francis bishop is Chicago's replacement for Francis Cardinal George, namely Blaise Cupich, who comes from Omaha, Nebraska. He's another individual I've known for 40 years, since he was a newly ordained curate at St. Margaret Mary's in Omaha, which was near to our Jesuit high school, Creighton Prep, where I was teaching as a young Jesuit scholastic of about 10. My aunt belonged to St. Margaret Mary's, and I went there every week to worship. Blaise is a wonderfully human and pastoral individual, and we have a large interconnected circle of close friends from that day to this. He studied with one of my teachers, Joseph Fuchs, at the Gregorian in Rome, and I think that this same approach to conscience shines through his remarks here. To illustrate his understanding of conscience and action, he told the following anecdote. Now, to make it clear, this is not something that he himself did. It is an anecdote that was told to him that he then passed on to, to the rest of us. It's remarkable on many levels that an archbishop would even recount this in public is an example of the parousia that I think Pope Francis hoped for and the amount of paradigm shift that has already occurred. I also think it is an excellent example of Pope Francis's call for pastors to work in a church which is like a field hospital, and thus to risk not only a mixed metaphor in taking on the smell of the sheep. Cupich got considerable pushback from the right wing, with any number of blogs accusing him of being, quote unquote, a heretic and consorting with sodomites. An innovation in this synod was that the so-called Circuli Minores, the small language groups, met throughout the synod in the afternoons rather than in just the last week. Each group elected a moderator who acted as sort of a facilitator, and more importantly, a relator who would be charged with drawing up the report of the particular group. Here are some of the key excerpts from Archbishop Chaput's group that I think highlight the ongoing cultural divide and strong resistance to any significant change if it was seen as relaxing church standards. The counter approach of the German cardinals is seen here by Cardinal Schönborn, who is the Cardinal Archbishop of Vienna and a doctoral student of Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict. Point and counterpoint emerge from these different Circuli Minores, and here the German language group which had a diverse group. It had Cardinal Kasper, Cardinal Schönborn, and the head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal Gerhard Müller. In a Deutschliche fashion, these erstwhile adversaries were able to come to a consensus, at least in the abstract, on individual pastoral solutions that might represent some real change from the position outlined by Pope John Paul II in his Familiaris Consortio issued after the last synod in 1980. And at this point, I'd like you to look at the handout that you have that has paragraph 85 from this final report, and then look at the section of Familiaris Consortio that is quoted. But more interesting, look at what ended up on the cutting room floor. So you can read that either now or later on. Back to Archbishop Chaput. So his group said this is how we ought to deal pastorally with the issue of homosexuality. Ultimately, in the final report, which unfortunately is still not out in English, I've read it in Italian, they really punted all of the issues dealing with homosexuality, and they simply said families that have gay children ought to be supported in a special way. But I would hold this up as another example of a contrasting approach from the John Paul II era to the Pope Francis era. The whole issues revolve, I think, around a basic core modality of how we are human. I would highlight culture as a basic modality of how we're human, and sexuality is a basic modality of how we are human. There is no asexual human being, just like there's no acultural human being. And so we have some of our sharpest battles in this area. I think also it's important to note that not every lay participant would necessarily see things in the same way we might expect in the American Academy. Sexuality involves so many complex issues that I predict it will be decades or longer before a real consensus emerges in the church and the world on many of these issues. In the middle of the Synod, Pope Francis was to give what is called an occasional allocution, marking the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Synod of Bishops. Most expected a typical address for these sorts of anniversaries, long on accolades and short on substance. But Pope Francis really took Paul VI's Synod hopes to heart and delivered a remarkable address that set ecclesiologists abuzz around the world. We don't have time here, unfortunately, to probe this remarkable address, but the points I've highlighted definitely point to a profound paradigm shift if they in fact can take root, as Francis seems to hope. One of the strong concerns of the epistolary committee of the 13 cardinals was, as well as a large number of right-wing commentators, was on the composition of the drafting committee for the Synod's final report. It's important, though, to remember that the committee's charge was collation and integration, and not creation. Ultimately, most commentators, except the ultra-right-wing diehards, felt that as a whole, the drafting committee was sufficiently credible and trustworthy. And they have a Jesuit in it, too, at the end, our Superior General, Father Nicolas. I had hoped that we would have had the final report available in English well before this date, but alas, that was not the case. Please now look at the other handout that you have. On one side, it's a list of follow-up resources, but on the reverse side, it's sort of color-coded, you have some of the more contested paragraphs. And I've listed these in order of those most contested down to those less contested, along with the numbers of votes positive, negative, and interestingly, abstentions. They had for every 10 people never showed up to vote, and of those that showed up to vote, every paragraph had somewhere between 4 and 11 abstentions. Now, it's very hard to figure out why someone would abstain. It could be because you didn't like that particular paragraph, you didn't like the whole idea, you were uncomfortable with your version of Italian, but for whatever reason, there were a good number of abstentions. The Synod itself is an ongoing enterprise. The meeting that just concluded is not technically the whole Synod. It is a meeting of the Synod. And so the Synod, as an ongoing reality and organ in the Church, has a standing committee to help prepare for the next Synod. So in the past Synod, on the standing committee were Cardinals Dolan and Wuerl. Those elected give a good geographical and theological cross-section of the Church as it is today. The Synod is technically only advisory to the Pope, but clearly Pope Francis wants to have unfettered advice which he will then take seriously. The voting protocols for the standing committee were such that only one bishop per country could be elected. Chaput got the most votes, but the runner-up was Supich. But because Chaput had been elected, Supich was therefore ineligible. In the Extraordinary Synod of 2014, Pope Francis's final discourse was constructed to reach for the middle and to give some points to both sides of the theological and political spectrum. However, I suspect that those on the right this time feel that the concluding discourse gave them fewer sound bites to celebrate. The synod is now over, so let the spin begin. We will keep spinning until the Pope issues his expected post-synodal message. Usually it's what's called a post-synodal apostolic exhortation, but it could be an encyclical, it could be a homily would be a bit low. It could be a speech, but we will have to see. Probably it will come out sometime this spring or summer. So, bringing it home. In the pre-Vatican II church and world, the classicist paradigm reigned, which held that all of reality was essentially fixed. And so what was true in the 13th, the greatest of the centuries, would be equally valid in our century and moving forward to the 23rd and beyond. Since Vatican II, however, the counter-paradigm of historicity has increasingly gained predominance. And thus, in that sense, these words of T.S. Elliott, I think, are especially perceptive. As the above lines from Elliott indicate, in the final analysis, there are not all that many new things under the sun. If this is the case, then maybe some wisdom from one of our early church fathers, St. Augustine, might be a helpful guide to the discernment and the integration in the aftermath of the synod. And a final perspective comes from building on this Augustinian insight, is a theological reminder of whose is the church, its mission, and ultimately the foundation for the kingdom to come. Christos, who is the world's and our Alpha and Omega. And now, as Melinda indicated, here is our question for discussion. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much to Father Bretzke. As you see, the question is up here. We'd like you to take a quiet moment or two to think about it, and then turn to someone beside you or behind you, probably not more than two other people, and have a conversation about your thoughts on that. As I mentioned earlier, Susan Reynolds will be giving the response next on the very same question that we've just been speaking about. Susan is a PhD student in theology and education at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. She holds a Master's of Theological Studies from the STM and a Master's of Education from the University of Notre Dame. Her research focuses on religious practices in multicultural parishes. She and her husband are actively engaged in ministry at their parish, which is St. Mary of the Angels in Roxbury. They are the parents of a young daughter, Nora, who was born in February. Nora was here. I'm not sure if she still is or not. She is sound asleep and staying quiet to support her mother. Please welcome Susan Reynolds.
Thanks, Melinda. There's an older woman at my parish named Geraldine. Every Sunday, during the prayers of the faithful, Geraldine prays the following prayer. Say it with me if you know it, St. Mary's Families. For families everywhere where dissension and discord exist, I pray that they might put aside the hatred and hostilities that divide them, and know that as they are loved by God, so they might in turn love and cherish one another. We pray to the Lord. Geraldine has been praying the same prayer for as long as I have been at the parish, for as long, probably, as she has been at the parish. Geraldine is not a theologian. Geraldine is not a pastoral minister. Geraldine is a member of a family in which, presumably, dissension and discord exist. Every week, Geraldine voices her family's reality, uniting it with the wounds of all families. She reads this reality in light of the gospel, and she utters a hope-filled prayer for healing and reconciliation. I want to begin by thanking Father Bretzke for his insightful presentation, which has given us a fresh way into thinking about an event that has been covered from so many angles. Given what we've heard this evening and what we understand to be the outcomes of the Synod, the question that has been put to us is, what are the next steps the Church needs to take? In this brief response to that question, I hope to highlight what I, as a pastoral theologian, wife, mother, and lay ecclesial minister, see as the promise of the work both done and yet to be done in light of the Synod. I want to locate that promise in the synodal process itself, which Father Bretzke has helped to illuminate for us this evening. The Synod of Bishops, as Father Bretzke noted, is a relatively young and uniquely post-conciliar institution, and for those reasons, an intriguing one. The Synod was instituted 50 years ago by Paul VI at the conclusion of the Second Vatican Council. It was meant to be a consultative body to the Pope that would keep alive the Council's spirit of collegiality. The unprecedented level of public attention directed at this Synod and at the 2014 Extraordinary Synod suggests that, to some degree, the Synod process itself has been reinvigorated by Pope Francis's personalist ecclesiological approach. This ecclesiology is captured most vividly in his now well-known image of the Church as field hospital, as Father Bretzke noted. In the 2013 interview published in America magazine and widely circulated, Francis said, "I see clearly that the thing this Church needs most today is the ability to heal wounds and to warm the hearts of the faithful. It needs nearness, proximity. I see the Church as a field hospital after battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of his blood sugar." Classic Pope Francis. You have to heal his wounds. Then we can talk about everything else. You have to start from the ground up, he said. This metaphor is rather remarkable when you think about what a field hospital actually is. A field hospital does not encounter suffering people because they have made an appointment to come in for a checkup. It goes out to the war zone, intentionally incarnating itself in the midst of horrific human suffering. It bases its practice on the exigencies of the wounded themselves, not on a pre-formulated notion of what, in a perfect world, should be there. This approach indeed represents, as Father Bretzke noted, a true paradigm shift. Francis's ecclesiology is deeply influenced by his Latin American context and by the themes and methodology of the Latin American bishops' conferences, particularly the 2007 Aparecida concluding document, which he edited. Central to his ecclesiological vision is the notion of a poor church for the poor, a Samaritan church that sees the wounded as neighbor. In his opening address, Francis remarked that the Synod is, quote, "neither a convention, nor a parlor, nor a parliament, or a senate, where people make deals and reach compromises. Rather," he said, "it is an ecclesial expression of this field hospital church, reading reality with the eyes of faith and with the heart of God, and in so doing, making a preferential option for those he called the difficult cases and wounded families, those he's referred to in the past with the Spanish word sobrantes, which means leftovers, but it's a very biting term in Spanish. These are his concern." Francis's preferential concern for the wounded prompted some Synod participants and observers, including Cardinal Dolan and others, as we heard, to speak out in behalf of the so-called new minority of good and virtuous Catholics whose fidelity to church teaching was being overshadowed by the Synod's emphasis on the marginalized and excluded. Another popular and widely read Catholic blogger, whose work is syndicated by the National Catholic Register, similarly lamented that the Synod's focus on, quote, avant-garde sins begging for extravagant mercy has made, quote, the Catholics who did everything right feel ignored. Such critiques of the Synod under Francis, and they were legion, were, in my opinion, well-intentioned but poorly framed for two reasons. First, they were too reminiscent of the prodigal son's older brother, for whom the father's gratuitous mercy sparked only indignation. Second, it seems that underlying such critiques was a subtle yearning to abandon the messiness of reflecting on the real wounds of real families for the comfort of talking about spiritualized wounds of hypothetical families. This is not what mercy demands, and it is not what reality demands. A better response, one that flows not from self-righteous indignation at God's scandalous mercy, but from the Synod's spirit of encounter, would have invited all people to recognize, as Geraldine does at my parish every Sunday in the prayers of the faithful, that though its forms may vary, dissension and discord form a painful part of every family's story. It does so in ways that often go unrecognized and unspoken, yet cry out for pastoral recognition. I will give an example from my own pastoral and theological work. Much of my work has focused on the need for the Church to respond more adequately to women and families grieving the loss of a child in the womb. This widespread kind of loss represents a crushing grief for millions of families, and yet it is an issue on which the Church is pastorally and liturgically silent. I mention this as just one example of the many, many unspoken wounds suffered by families around the world, wounds that beg for a pastoral response. What can the Church say to couples suffering the pain of infertility, to families divided by divorce and estrangement, to families wounded by domestic violence, substance abuse, or poverty, families who have opened their hearts and homes to adoption, families struggling to raise children with severe physical or cognitive disabilities, adults caring for aging parents, children who are bullied for being different or gay or transgender, children who live in the uncertainty of foster care, elderly people who suffer from loneliness and social isolation. Additionally, it is important for us here, most of us white, middle-class, well-educated U.S. Americans, to keep in mind that we, not the poor and marginalized, are the outliers. Most Catholic families around the world live in contexts marked in some way by material poverty, threats of gang violence, political and religious repression, and systemic racism. These families do not need to look to the culture warriors and conspiracy theorists to invent crises for them. Mexican and Central American families crossing scorching deserts and walled borders on foot. Syrian families trading their life savings for a life jacket and a spot on a plastic boat. South African families decimated by the AIDS crisis. Families on the south side of Chicago living in fear of their kindergartners being killed by stray bullets on the playground. I mention this mosaic of scenarios not to critique the Synod Fathers for their inability to address every conceivable social issue. Indeed, many of these issues did receive a hearing in various interventions, so I have read, some of which I understand were quite powerful, and were subsequently integrated in various ways into the Synod's final report. The purpose of the Synod, as Pope Francis noted in his closing homily, was not to provide a list of definitive answers to every possible pastoral question. Rather, the Synod was an ecclesial exercise in courageous speech, in recognizing that the signs of the times are not ideas, but people. It was also an exercise in listening. Father Bretzke has given us plenty of examples to suggest that this, the listening, was the most challenging part of all. So, what is the work that lies ahead? The Synod has given us more than a soon-to-be-translated final report. In fact, from a pastoral perspective, I might suggest that the final report and any other subsequent documents is far from the most important thing it will have given us. It has renewed for us a process. The Synod culminates in the Assembly of Bishops in Rome, but it does not begin there, and it does not end there. In his address marking the 50th anniversary of the Synod, Pope Francis concentrated on the vital role of all believers, particularly the laity, in the synodal process. As we approach the upcoming year of mercy, there is much from this process that can vivify practices at the parish level. First, we can ask ourselves where the Holy Spirit is calling each of us to speak with parousia, with boldness, courage, and conviction. What is it in my lived reality, in the lived reality of my family, that cries out to be heard by the community? What wounds am I carrying? What are the wounds of my family? What wounds of others and of the world have I borne witness to? How can we make our communities of faith places that do not censor people's cries by jumping to judgment or explaining them away with easy answers? Can we dare to allow the groups of people about whom so much has been said by the bishops speak of their own wounds in their own words? Second, and inseparably related, what must I do to create space inside myself for genuine listening? There is no clearer evidence than the Synod proceedings themselves of the ease with which we allow the forces of polarization to hijack our ability to listen to the voices and experiences of others. We can speak as boldly and as candidly as we want to, but conversion only happens when we listen. Francis called the bishops to listen with, quote, evangelical humility that knows how to empty itself of conventions and prejudices in order to listen and be filled with God. Humility that leads neither to finger pointing nor to judging others, but to hands outstretched to help people up without ever feeling oneself superior to them, end quote. Humble listening is vulnerable listening. It is listening that risks being interrupted, decentered, made uncomfortable, surprised, and converted when faced with the sufferings of another. A synodal church is a listening church, Francis told the bishops. It is a mutual listening in which everyone has something to learn, he said. Synod means literally journeying together, walking together. It is through this careful dynamic of bold speech and humble listening that we become, at the grassroots in our parishes and communities, a synodal church. If the church is a field hospital, then a synod is an exercise in listening to the cries and the needs of the wounded in its midst, so that we all, as disciples, can undertake more effectively the work of healing the dissension and discord that exist. I participated once in an anti-racism workshop, and at the end of the workshop, the facilitators told us, the work is not the workshop. The work is not the workshop, right? This was the workshop. You have to go do the work now. I would say the same of the synod. The work is not the synod. The work is healing. The synod did its job. Now it falls to the rest of the church, the people of God, to do ours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan Reynolds. Now I'd like to invite Father Bretzke and Susan Reynolds to come up and receive questions and comments from all of you. Just a reminder to wait for the microphone, that our students will, yes, just raise your hand and they'll be there. Thank you.
Thank you to both the presenters for your words. I was thinking about changes I'd like to recommend, or if I really felt that it hit the mark. And two things that come to mind when I think of the Synod is, number one, where were the voice of women? Because we held an entire meeting about the family and we're missing, in my opinion, women and the voice of women. And two, it just seemed to me like it became the Cardinal show and the media latched onto that. And the testimony of the laity was overshadowed, and to me it harkened back to when we had similar conversations about contraception, and the laity came forward with a majority report, but the minority, upholding a minority report, but the minority report was taken. So I just feel like the laity is kind of put up there sometimes as a gesture, and I'm wondering if you can tame some of my cynicism in that and give me some hope, both for women and the laity in these really momentous times.
Well, to begin with, I'm looking for my participants slide. First of all, I would just underscore it's a synod of bishops, and there are no women bishops. Now that is another issue, obviously, but it is a synod of bishops. There were women involved. Let me move that up. Oops, I overdid it. So you had 18 couples, so husband and wife, a number of experts, and I didn't track those out in terms of gender, but there were single lay men and single lay women, and then a number of auditors, and then some fraternal delegates, which is the code word for non-Catholics. There were voices recorded. In this presentation, I could only give a couple, and I did in fact give a couple of the interventions by some women. But your larger point is very well taken, and I can't say much about it. And this is probably an example or another example of substantiating my thesis about cultural change. If it's going to be change that is cultural, it's going to be slow and really, really quite difficult. So that's my take on it.
Sure. You ask, tame my cynicism, please, and no. I would just like to echo, I think some of your own concerns and reactions were also my own. Obviously, the synod is a synod of bishops, but we're talking about the family. And in what way can we really substantively have a conversation if we're not really systematically including the voices of women? Of course, there were the questionnaires that went out before the 2014 synod. There might have been one actually before the 2015 synod as well, but it was long, it was complex, it was poorly executed, nice idea, poorly executed, and it wasn't clear how those voices were actually integrated and brought to the table. The recognition, at least, I think was there on the part of some, but it wasn't clear to me how those voices were systematically integrated into the reflections. And I agree with you too. This mirrors a conversation we were having in small group that it might the sort of the Cardinal show, the soap opera might be intriguing, I think, to some of us in the theological world, the kind of the insiders. But most people, they don't care about the Cardinal show. They have. As I said, they don't need the culture warriors to invent problems for them. They have problems of their own. And I think it did become very distracting, this focus on the cardinals themselves and the bishops themselves. And I think that the people who felt that probably most palpably were women. Because I think if you were to ask most of the men in the room, who's responsible for your faith, I think 99.9% of them would have said, my mother, my grandmother, my aunt. And that's very, very important. So I think your point is well taken.
I just have two comments. Thank you both. It was a wonderful presentation. I think the reference to the prodigal son, his brother, that was perfect for summing up the attitude. And in just thinking about the ways in which reception of communion can be policed, I would just kind of contrast this policing attitude with what Paul says, I believe it's Paul, nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. And in a sense, by denying someone communion, you're withholding Christ from the person. And I sure wouldn't want to make that decision. And I'm amazed that some people can.
Are you willing to do a little prophecy? What will Pope Francis do with this? What do you think? Are you willing to take a stab at this?
Of course I'm willing. The question is, will I be accurate? I believe I have, in fact, fielded questions like this before for the media. And one of the points that I make over and over again is Pope Francis remarkably stays on message, no matter how the genre is, whether it be a off-the-cuff press conference remark to an encyclical, to this Jubilee year of mercy. This is his message over and over and over again, that we have to be merciful, we have to reach out to the people who are wounded and hurting, and we have to try to heal them. So I think now here's the prophecy. A good leader has to lead, but he can't be so far ahead of the people that he loses, the stragglers. I think Paul VI tried to lead the church after Vatican II, but he got caught up by, I think, the fear of pushing ahead too quickly, and I think he got caught up with the fear of the more conservative elements of the church. And I think we see that worked out tragically in the Humani Vitae encyclical of 1968. I think Francis is going to try to be a leader, but he has to make sure that he's got most of the organization walking with him. My prediction is we're going to get a papal address that very closely mirrors the language contained within the final report, especially paragraphs 84, 85, and 86. You've got in front of you paragraph 85 with a provisional translation that I had a hand in. So it could be wrong. Well, it can't be that wrong, but it could be that it's not going to be the same as the official translation. Paragraphs 84, 85, and 86 never mention explicitly the word communion. They talk about particularity, pastoral adaptation, dialogue, discernment, integration. I think the Pope's message, my prophecy is, it's going to be language like that will leave doors open rather than slam shut. And he's certainly, I don't think, going to try to force those who are not yet ready to come along onto one particular policy. So that's my prediction. Susan?
Yeah, time will tell. I think the most that I would expect in a concrete way would be very much along the lines of what Father Bretzke just articulated, which is sort of a language that's possibly more open and capacious than what we're used to seeing, but certainly not the kind of radical change that I think people are, some people were hoping for and then disappointed that didn't happen. Like, what were you expecting? But I think if anything is new or surprising, it'll be the capaciousness of the language. So I think that's what I'm kind of interested in.
With the Pope going to Africa shortly, I'm wondering what we might expect from him in terms of what he says there that might be some reflection of his initial thoughts about what happened at the Synod, and what do you also think might be kind of the flavor of his sense of Africa and what he thinks needs to be said?
Well, one thing about these papal visits that is helpful to keep in mind, the Pope doesn't write a lot of his talks at night when he's got nothing better to do. Most of these addresses are formulated in the place that he's going to be visiting. So if you want to, what is he going to say in Africa? Well, it's going to be, I think, to some extent, he's going to be picking up on the things that the African bishops will be lifting up. Now, I would be astounded, I have been astounded before, but I would be astounded if he were to echo, for example, the kind of language that Cardinal Sarah used, calling demonic in origin Western homosexual gender ideologies. That would be a shift of a sort. I don't expect him to say that. But I think he probably will reiterate a message that he has said before. He said it when he was in Asia, in the Philippines. He talks about the danger of a colonization of ideology. I don't think he truly understands gender theory. I have a few of my students here that I would be happy to send to him. They're sitting over there in the back, because I think they could really help him in this matter. So to some extent, there's a learning curve involved. What will he talk about in Africa? I think he's going to be talking about issues that are economic, that are family issues, the AIDS crisis and how that has fractured so many families, whole populations. That's what I think he's going to be talking about, but we will see.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to Father Bretzke and to Susan Reynolds for their wonderful presentations. And I hope we'll see you again soon.